Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever wanted to know how Washington actually works behind the scenes, you are in the exact right place today.
You really are. It is a completely different world back there.
Yeah, it is. And we know you're out there listening, you, the learner. You want the real story about how power is organized, but you definitely don't want to be put to sleep by endless procedural rule books or just a swamp of legislative jargon.
No one wants that.
Right. You want the mechanics, the friction, the actual history delivered in a way that respects your time.
It's a great space to be in because the real mechanics of government are rarely what they teach you in high school civics. I mean, there's this whole hidden architecture that dictates what actually gets done on a daily basis.
Exactly. And today, our mission is to explore a truly brilliant example of that hidden architecture. We are digging into the history, the evolution, and the current state of a very unique entity in the American government, the United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs.
And to set the stage properly for you, we really need to look at the core mandate of this committee. It handles matters related to American Indian, Native Hawaiian, and Alaskan Native peoples.
Which is a huge umbrella.
It is. And I cannot stress enough what a massive deal it is to have a dedicated committee for these specific populations in the grand scheme of American governance. We are talking about sovereign nations here.
Right, sovereign nations.
Distinct indigenous populations that have a very unique constitutional and historical relationship with the federal government. Having a centralized legislative body to address those complex nation-to-nation relationships is absolutely crucial.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because starting with what this committee actually does today, on paper it sounds like just another administrative branch, but it is so much more than that.
So much more.
The specific jurisdictions are staggering. I mean, they handle Native education, economic development, land management, healthcare, and claims against the United States. Plus, they manage something called trust responsibilities.
Yeah, trust responsibilities.
Yes, trust responsibilities. But before we go any further, what does that actually mean in practice? When we say the government has trust responsibilities over native lands, what exactly are we talking about?
That is the pivotal concept here. Trust responsibility is essentially the federal government's legal and moral obligation to protect tribal treaty rights, their lands, assets, and resources.
Okay.
When tribes ceded millions of acres of land to the United States, it wasn't just a basic real estate transaction. It was done through treaties where the federal government promised in return to protect the tribe's right to self-government.
So it's an ongoing legal promise.
Exactly. A promise to provide certain basic services like healthcare and education. The Committee on Indian Affairs is essentially the legislative watchdog meant to ensure the United States is actually keeping those centuries-old promises.
So if any senator proposes a piece of legislation that specifically pertains to American Indians, Native Hawaiians, or Alaska Natives, it falls right under their umbrella.
What's fascinating here is the sheer breadth of that jurisdiction. If you think about it, most Senate committees are strictly specialized.
Right, like you have an agriculture committee.
Or a finance committee, or Veterans Affairs. They focus on one slice of American life. But this single committee essentially acts as a mini-government.
A mini government. I like that.
It covers economics, it covers healthcare, it covers massive tracts of real estate and land management, and it handles complex legal claims. It's a horizontal slice across all areas of life tailored to sovereign native peoples rather than a vertical slice of one specific industry.
That is a wild amount of power for one committee. I mean, to handle a portfolio that covers everything from building hospitals to managing forests, you need a very specific team.
You really do.
Looking at the current roster for the 119th Congress, there are 11 members in total. 6 Republicans who hold the majority and 5 Democrats in the minority. And the leadership consists of Chair Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, and Vice Chair Brian Schatz, a Democrat from Hawaii.
And if you look closely at that roster, a very deliberate geographic pattern emerges. It isn't just a random assortment of senators pulled from a hat.
No, it is highly specific. The committee tends to be heavily dominated by senators from Western and Plains states. Alaska, Hawaii, North Dakota, Montana, Oklahoma, South Dakota, New Mexico, Washington, Nevada.
Notice anyone missing?
Right, why is that? Why don't we see a bunch of senators from New York or Massachusetts clamoring to get on this committee?
It comes down to constituency overlap. These Western and Plains states have significantly higher Native American populations and massive swaths of tribal lands right within their borders.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Regional geography essentially dictates national legislative power in this instance. The senators who sit on this committee are the ones whose home states are directly and heavily impacted by the policies they draft.
Which is exactly how you'd want it to work. You want the people whose constituents are dealing with these issues day to day to be the ones holding the pen.
Precisely. The lived realities of their voters are deeply intertwined with the jurisdiction of this committee.
But as logical as that setup sounds today, it hasn't always been this streamlined. In fact, a whole century of history was basically erased at one point.
Yes, erased is the right word.
The original committee had a massive established run from 1820 all the way until 1946. That is over 100 years of dedicated infrastructure.
A very long institutional memory. But
Right.
1946 brought a massive disruption.
Right. In 1946, Congress passed the Legislative Reorganization Act, which completely abolished both the House and Senate committees on Indian affairs.
Just gone.
Gone. They took all of those vital Native affairs we just talked about, education, healthcare, treaty rights, and folded them into mere subcommittees of the Interior and Insular Affairs committees.
Which fundamentally degrades the level of attention, authority, and funding given to these issues. I mean, a subcommittee simply does not have the same teeth or resources as a full committee.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean incredibly dark. This demotion to a subcommittee wasn't just a random piece of bureaucratic housecleaning.
No, it was not.
It coincided with a 20-year hiatus in Native affairs known as the Termination Era. So what exactly was the Termination Era? Did the government just decide to stop talking to tribes?
It was far more aggressive than that. The termination era was a period where the prevailing explicit policy of the United States government was to outright terminate the federal relationship with Native tribes.
Terminate it completely.
Yes. The goal was rapid, forced assimilation. The government sought to dismantle tribal sovereignty entirely, end the federal trust responsibilities we talked about earlier, and transfer jurisdiction over tribal lands and peoples directly to the states.
So they basically said, we're voiding the treaties, you're on your own, figure it out with the state governments.
Effectively, yes. It was a profound and devastating shift. If we connect the dots here, you can see how dangerous a shift from a dedicated Senate committee to a policy of termination truly was.
Because there's no one to fight for them in Washington.
Exactly. You take sovereign populations that legally rely on a direct nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, and you dismantle the very legislative body meant to oversee that relationship. And you do it right at the exact moment the government is actively trying to end the relationship altogether.
The structural change in the Senate was basically the weapon used to carry out the policy shift. Without a full committee to push back, it was much easier to quietly roll back a century of tribal rights.
The architecture of the Senate perfectly mirrored the hostility of the era's policy.
That is terrifying when you realize how much damage can be done just by shuffling a flowchart.
It really is.
But by the mid-1960s, the termination philosophy started to face massive pushback. It was failing spectacularly, creating deep poverty and social crises. The era finally decisively ended with the enactment of the Menominee Restoration Act of 1973. What did that act actually do?
The Menominee Restoration Act was a massive turning point. The Menominee Nation in Wisconsin had been one of the tribes legally terminated by the federal government. This 1973 act officially reversed that.
Okay, so they brought them back into recognized status.
Yes. It restored their federal recognition, restored their sovereign rights, and reestablished the trust relationship. It was Congress formally admitting that the termination era was a failure and signaling a return to a policy of recognition and rebuilding.
Okay, so the federal government changes its mind. They want to start rebuilding social infrastructure and providing economic opportunities for tribes again. But they ran into a wall because the bureaucratic structure was a total nightmare.
The classic Washington problem. You have a new policy goal, but the machinery is broken.
Exactly. Imagine you, the learner, are trying to build a house, but the plumbers, the electricians, and the framers all speak different languages and report to entirely different bosses. Because the original committee had been abolished back in '46, Native affairs had been splintered.
Splintered everywhere.
By the early 1970s, legislative jurisdiction over Native issues was fragmented across more than 10 different congressional committees.
Think about the friction that creates. If a tribe is trying to negotiate a comprehensive solution that involves land rights, water access, and school funding, they can't just go to one committee.
They're bouncing between a dozen different congressional offices,
None of which have the full picture.
none of which consider Native affairs their top priority. It led to incredibly disjointed, haphazard development of federal native policy. It was structural chaos.
And that chaos required a very deliberate fix. The turning point began in 1973 when Senator James Aberesk introduced Senate Joint Resolution 133. This resolution created the American Indian Policy Review Commission, which was officially signed into law in January 1975.
So they create a commission, basically a massive task force to review all aspects of policy, law, and administration and figure out how to clean up the mess.
Precisely. And as this commission went to work, interviewing tribal leaders and reviewing the fractured laws, they had a major epiphany.
Which one?
They realized a massive truth about how government actually functions. You cannot implement sweeping systemic recommendations without a full Senate committee that possesses true legislative and oversight authority.
A subcommittee can't do it.
No.
10 fragmented committees certainly can't do it.
Right. You need a centralized, powerful hub that can subpoena records, draft comprehensive bills, and hold the executive branch accountable. One of the commission's final, most critical recommendations was exactly that, the reestablishment of a full-fledged Indian Affairs Committee in the Senate.
But getting that permanent committee was absolute bureaucratic warfare. It became this incredible fight for permanency that stretched from 1977 all the way to 1984.
It was a slog.
Because at the exact same time the commission was saying, hey, we need a dedicated committee, the Senate was actually trying to reorganize its entire committee system to shrink the number of committees. Their initial plan was to abolish the subcommittee on Indian Affairs entirely.
It was a very precarious moment. The Senate's reorganization plan was going to scatter the natural resource functions of Native Affairs to new committees and hand all the human resources functions over to the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources.
Which means Labor and Human Resources would suddenly have control over massive amounts of funding and policy. Why didn't they just create the permanent committee right then and there in 1977?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to remember that power in Washington is a zero-sum game. Jurisdiction equals power.
Right.
If you create a new committee, you are taking jurisdiction and therefore power, relevance, and funding away from an existing committee. The Committee on Labor and Human Resources did not want to lose that portfolio.
But the sheer volume and gravity of the issues made it obvious that treating Native Affairs as a side project in a labor committee would be a disaster. The Senate finally realized it had a constitutional, legal, and historical responsibility that demanded a dedicated space.
They had to pivot.
So they pivoted. In February 1977, they passed Senate Resolution 4. They detached Indigenous Affairs from the new Committee on Energy and National Resources, and they created a select committee on Native Affairs. But here is the massive catch. It was temporary.
Being a select committee in this context was essentially a trial run. It was a temporary life raft.
Right. Being a select committee with a hard expiration date is like being a temp worker at a corporation. You're doing the job, you have zero job security, you get none of the institutional benefits, and management could legally let you go at the end of the year.
Exactly. The resolution explicitly stated this select committee would disband at the close of the 95th Congress.
They had to prove they're worthwhile, constantly fighting off their own extinction.
Every single session.
And what followed was a grueling 7-year legislative relay race for survival. I want to walk you through this timeline because it shows the sheer political willpower required to overcome bureaucratic inertia. In 1978, Senator Aberesk fights to get a 2-year extension. He just manages to push the expiration date to January 2, 1981.
He essentially passes the baton to the next Congress, keeping the temp worker employed for a few more months.
Then we hit 1980. Senator John Melcher takes over as chair. He pushes a resolution to finally make it permanent. He faces pushback, he doesn't get permanency, but he does manage to wring out another extension, this time to 1984. Crucially, he also manages to expand the committee membership to 7 members.
That expansion is important. The life raft is getting bigger, which means more senators have a vested personal interest in keeping the committee alive. It is gaining institutional weight.
Then comes the final sprint, April 1983. Senator Mark Andrews is now the chair, and he introduces Senate Resolution 127 to finally make the committee permanent. He starts with 28 co-sponsors, but it is an agonizingly slow process.
Washington moves at its own pace.
They get to the very last day of the legislative session in November, and they haven't voted on it. They have to pass one more tiny extension just to keep it alive until July 1984, just to allow time for debate.
They're constantly operating on the edge of the cliff.
But all of that friction, all of those delays, actually allowed momentum to build. By the time it hits the floor for actual consideration, they go from 28 co-sponsors to 60 co-sponsors.
A huge jump.
And finally, on June 6, 1984, the Select Committee on Indian Affairs is officially made a permanent committee of the United States Senate. They fought for 7 years just to get hired full-time.
It was a tremendous bureaucratic victory.
Mm.
It fundamentally secured the platform for native legislation. Once you are permanent, you get guaranteed budgets, dedicated staff, and you cannot easily be swept under the rug by shifting political winds.
And in 1993, they officially dropped the word select from the title, fully solidifying its status simply as the Committee on Indian Affairs.
A fully entrenched part of the Senate.
The history of how this committee survived is incredible. But as we look at its legacy today, there are a few really unique details about how it operates internally. For one, the naming conventions. Most Senate committees call their top minority party member the ranking member. But this committee refers to its ranking minority member specifically as the vice chair. Why the distinction?
This raises an important question about the internal culture they intentionally built. Words matter in politics. Calling someone a ranking member implies a hierarchy and an adversarial role. Calling someone a vice chair signals partnership.
It sounds much more cooperative.
It does. When you look at the historical leadership roster, it paints a picture of a unique bipartisan dynamic.
You see the exact same names coming up again and again across different decades.
You do. The chairmanship frequently bounced between parties, but the individuals stayed intensely dedicated to the work. For instance, in the late 90s and early 2000s, you see Democrat Daniel Inouye of Hawaii and Republican Ben Campbell of Colorado.
The hitters.
Absolutely. Depending on which party won the majority in the Senate that cycle, they would essentially just swap the chair and vice chair roles and keep working. You also see Republican John McCain holding the chairmanship for multiple tenures.
So it wasn't just a stepping stone committee, it was a career focus.
Absolutely. What this demonstrates is a continuous bipartisan engagement with Native affairs once the committee was finally made permanent. It attracted dedicated leadership from both sides of the aisle who stayed involved across multiple Congresses, building real institutional trust.
So what does this all mean for you? Why does a deep dive into the bureaucratic history of a Senate committee actually matter to your understanding of the world today?
It's a great question.
It matters because this history is proof that the actual physical structure of government dictates the survival and support of the people it governs. Whether a committee is a temporary temp worker, whether its power is fragmented across 10 different desks, or whether it is a permanent centralized hub, that structure determines whether policies fail or succeed.
The architecture of power shapes the outcome of the policy. You cannot solve a complex problem with a fragmented system.
Exactly. We've tracked a committee that existed for over a century, was erased during the dark, aggressive assimilation policies of the termination era, became a fragmented 10-committee mess, survived as a temporary life raft, and finally, through years of grinding legislative warfare, became a permanent fixture of the U.S. Senate.
And as we reflect on that journey, I want to leave you with a thought. We've seen how disastrous it was in the 1970s when Native affairs were fragmented across more than 10 different committees, leading to completely haphazard conflicting policies.
Right.
It makes you wonder. Looking at our government today, what other critical marginalized issues are currently suffering from that exact same fragmentation effect, waiting for their own dedicated committee to finally bring things into focus?
Oh, that is a brilliant question to chew on. Is climate change or artificial intelligence or data privacy suffering right now because the jurisdiction is split across a dozen different desks? Something to keep in mind the next time you hear about a complicated issue struggling to find a solution in Washington. Thank you, the learner, for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep looking past the jargon, and keep seeking out the fascinating stories hidden right there inside the bureaucracy. We will catch you next time.